Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased to welcome back onto the podcast Dr. Helen Cowie to tell us about her latest book titled Animals in World History, published by Routledge in 2024, which does a whole bunch of things in one book without somehow being 800 pages. This is a wonderfully concise book that tracks human-animal relations over time in a lot of different ways. So not just how humans and animals have interacted in different ways, but also how we've thought about animals in different ways, how we've historiographically analyzed human-animal relations. There's a whole bunch of things here that I'm very eager to talk about. So Helen, thank you so much for joining us again on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Miranda. It's a real pleasure.
Could you please introduce yourself, perhaps for listeners who've not heard your previous interview with us, and then tell us about this book project? What gave you the idea?
Yeah, of course. So I've been working on the history of animals for over a decade now. I began by thinking mostly about the history of natural history, and that mainly meant looking at dead animals in museums, particularly actually in the Hispanic world. I then went on to look at the history of zoos and travelling menageries. And the last book that I wrote and that I spoke to Miranda about was a book called Victims of Fashion, which looked at animal commodities in Victorian Britain, so particularly things like feathers, ivory, fur and alpaca wool, and sort of looked at the ethical questions surrounding these. In the case of this book, I was actually approached by Routledge to write the book. So they have a really interesting series called Themes in World History, which includes things like peasants in world history, industrialization in world history, disasters in world history. And the editor was keen to include a book on animals in the series. So it wasn't my idea. I have to give credit to the editor, Peter Stearns, for that. Initially, I was actually a bit hesitant about writing the book because, as you say, it covers a broad period. And I did wonder, am I capable of writing a book about all animals in all places and all time periods? So I wasn't sure about it. However, despite my doubts, the more I thought about it, the more I realised I did want to write this book. And I guess there are several reasons for that. One was that I actually teach a comparative undergraduate history module called Animals at the University of York. So that meant I was somewhat aware of at least some of the issues that I might want to include in the book. And I was also aware that there's a really wonderful and growing body of scholarship on animals across the world, from Mexico to Nigeria. And I guess I hoped that writing the book would give me the chance to maybe crystallise some of my own ideas on the history of pets or the history of animal labour, and also hopefully provide a bit of a useful resource for my students. I can't promise that I've achieved that, but I will say I have hugely enjoyed reading some of the literature on animals in China, Japan and Russia that I wouldn't usually get to look at in my research. And I've also really enjoyed finding some of the fascinating stories about individual animals that I've encountered, some of which appear in the book, from the kangaroo mascot Murphy on the USS Wisconsin to a Russian circus elephant that was purchased by the Bog Khan of Mongolia in 1913 and then apparently transported to his winter palace in Ulaanbaatar, where he fed it on steamed dumplings and red plums. So I learnt a lot writing the book and quite enjoyed it.
That sounds absolutely brilliant, to get to discover all those different pieces, both the kind of macro and the micro. So I personally am quite glad you decided to take on this project, despite the, as you said, massive scope of it. That is, in fact, kind of my obvious next question in reading it. I was, as I mentioned earlier, stunned that all of this could be covered without it being 800 pages. So can you tell us a bit more about kind of how you decided on that? Give us maybe an overview of which topics are covered in the book and tell us a bit about kind of how you decided on that organization.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I was slightly overwhelmed by the project initially. And I toyed with different ways of organising the material. So I thought about taking more of a chronological approach and looking at animals in different periods in each chapter, or maybe doing it geographically and looking at each continent. But in the end, for better or worse, I went for more of a thematic approach. And I thought that would be useful because it would enable me to, I guess, chart different human-animal interactions according to different themes, really. So to think about animals in labouring, for instance, and how that changed over time. So, in consequence, the book ended up having 7 chapters, and each of these looks at a different aspect of the animal-human relationship, though obviously there's a bit of overlap between them. So, in the first chapter, I think about the consumption of predominantly dead animals as food, fashion, fuel, and fertiliser, and how that's changed over time. In the second chapter, I look at animal labour. So I think about how a whole range of animals, from horses to camels to dogs, have provided humans with power, transportation, and also often with partners in things like hunting or in warfare. The third chapter focuses on animals as companions, so the history of pet keeping. The fourth chapter looks at the exhibition of animals in menageries, zoos and circuses in different places and time periods. The fifth chapter is focused on knowledge about animals, and that really has 2 halves. So in the first half, I think about studying animals in their own right, so as zoological specimens, thinking about their physiology, their behaviour. And the second half of the chapter focuses on animal experimentation, so effectively using animals as surrogate humans. The last 2 chapters take more of a broad brush view, and they think about how all these different uses of animals have impacted on the animals themselves. So both at a sort of population level and at an individual level. So in chapter 6, I think about how far humans have altered global biodiversity. That might be through things like deforestation or introducing invasive species, or increasingly now human-induced climate change. And then finally, in chapter 7, I think about the issue of animal suffering and animal rights. And I guess within that chapter, I'm really asking, have we become kinder or crueler to other species over time? Again, I'm very conscious of things I would have liked to explore further, places that I haven't talked about as much as I wanted. But I did really try quite deliberately to include, I guess, some maybe less familiar animals in the book. So some of the species I look at include manatees, okapis, kakapos, cochineal beetles. And I guess I just want to sort of really highlight the range of topics out there to explore. So even when I've not covered things as much as I would have liked, and as you said, Miranda, this could have been an 800-page book. Probably everybody's grateful that it's not. But hopefully other people might be able to, to look at these topics in a bit more depth.
That's so interesting to think about, kind of how you decided how to group things, I suppose, and also the idea of highlighting animals that are perhaps less familiar. So thank you for that overview. I think it gives us a whole bunch of things to talk about in more detail. The first one of which I suppose kind of came to me given the historian aspect of this, rather than any one of the particular topics. The next thing that I immediately thought of was sort of how we study this, the sort of methodological aspect of it. Because in some respects, listening to that lovely overview, it's like, oh yeah, no, we have loads of things we can study and it's all nicely laid out. And it's like, well, actually, once you start poking at it, there are some tricky methodological questions that arise if we're looking at non-human animals and their relations with humans. Can you maybe talk us through one or two of these trickiest methodological questions and how we might approach them?
Yeah, absolutely. There are all sorts of challenges in studying animal history. Obviously, animals don't write, so it's really hard to get their viewpoint. I guess I could group the key issues into, I suppose, two categories. So one is just locating sources about animals, and the other is then interpreting them. So if we think about how you actually find sources, I mean, there are a lot of sources out there. Animals appear in all kinds of things, from natural history texts to newspapers, letters, diaries, visual sources as well, things like portraits, later photographs. So they're out there. But what can be challenging is finding these sources. And this is partly because of how archives are organised. So often, you might go into an archive, there will be a whole, bunch of letters or diaries by a particular individual. But the label on that particular document might not say it features a dog in this photograph, or that this is mentions a pet cat. So sometimes you have to wade through quite a lot to find the animal. So that could be a bit of a challenge. And I guess, more broadly, it's worth noting that animals are quite unevenly spread throughout the sources. So, we have a lot of material on pets. Because obviously they were pretty close to humans. People write about them, people record them, people sometimes mourn them when they die. We have a similarly large amount on things like zoo and menagerie animals, again, because they were visible and because of their enforced proximity to humans. By contrast, things like livestock, you tend to have less personalised accounts. So you might have, statistics on, say, the number of oxen in a plantation logbook, or your list of diseased animals in public health registers, which are useful, but you don't get that same insight into the human-animal relationship. And, it's arguably similar with things like laboratory animals as well, which are often kind of made pretty much invisible in the historical record. People don't really want to read about or think about or personalise guinea pigs or rats that you're going to experiment on. So I guess what that means more broadly is that, when we're writing histories of animals, it's easier to write, say, the history of, a famous elephant like Jumbo than it is to, say, reconstruct the life story of a sheep in Patagonia or a snail in Hawaii. So there's an unevenness there in what remains. As for the interpretation side of things, again, that's a real challenge. So I guess some more sort of traditional histories of animals tend to think really mostly on just what humans have said about animals. So it's thinking about what animals represent, thinking about how humans feel about them and how that's changed over time, which we can recover and which is a completely legitimate thing to do. More recently, though, and again, I learned a lot about this reading wonderful work by other people for this book, historians are trying to ask a little bit more about the actual animal experience, what it was like to be a horse in 19th century Chicago or a pig in 18th century Britain. And again, that's challenging because obviously animals didn't write about it. But there are different ways in which people are trying to get at this. So one thing that people are trying to do, and which is really interesting, although sometimes problematic, is basically looking at contemporary work on animal behaviour, what's known as ethology, and trying to then interpret actions and emotions in animals that we find in the historical records, so obviously recorded by humans. So a really interesting example of this is from the French historian Eric Baratte, who has tried to reconstruct the journey of a young giraffe from Sudan to Paris in 1827. And he tries to do it from the perspective of the giraffe, applying knowledge, modern knowledge about psychology and physiology to what was written about the animal at the time. So he suggests, for instance, that the fact the giraffe was apparently constantly moving in its stall was probably because it was bored, and the fact that it didn't like to stoop down to eat food, as was reported, was because that's a really unnatural position for giraffes and they feel really vulnerable. So there are things we can kind of do in that vein to recover the animal perspective. Historians are also looking increasingly at often what people who worked really closely with animals thought about them. So that might be, say, hunters who had to know a lot about their quarries in order to track them down. So to know about their footprints, sometimes even to be able to kind of tell the sex of a deer from examining its excrement. Or it might be looking at things like zookeepers who, again, trained animals, might have mistreated them, but nonetheless often recognised that they were individuals with quite distinct abilities and personalities. So a sea lion trainer called Captain John Woodward, for example, claimed that some of his seals had a sense of humour. One of them was apparently full of fun and lively as a cricket, but others he could never induce to be funny. Again, we might question some of those conclusions, but they can be quite interesting to work with. And I guess lastly, historians are also using things like material culture to get a more sort of direct access to animals in the past, kind of bypassing human written work. So we have stuff like taxidermy, and some historians have tried to sort of reconstruct the biographies of animals based a little bit on that and other sources. And also particularly archaeologists have worked on animal remains, so things like bones, antlers and tools, which you can then date. You can maybe tell something about when these animals were domesticated, what age they were when they died. And so, for example, in 2011, some archaeologists working at Berenica on the Red Sea coast of Egypt excavated the skeletons of 86 cats, 9 dogs and several monkeys, which they think dated back to about the 2nd century AD. And they were able to tell various things about these animals. So they weren't mummified. They had beads around their necks. Some of them had collars, and some of them seemed to have reached old age before they died. And all those things led them to believe that these animals were probably pets. So there are different ways of kind of getting at animals in the past, but again, often quite unevenly. And there are challenges to all those methods.
Of course, there are challenges, but the only way we're ever going to make any progress in sorting them out is by having these kinds of conversations and having them written down in books like this. So thank you for explaining some of them to us, obviously with more detail in the book as well for people who want to get into that piece more. I want to, however, make sure we talk about some of the other many topics covered in the book. So focusing then on, I suppose, the most direct link between this book of yours and the previous book that we've discussed, can we talk about the consumption of animal commodities and how that's changed over time? Obviously, last time we were talking about it in conjunction with empire. Was that kind of the biggest impact in understanding the changing patterns, or are there other things we should be aware of in looking at this change over time?
That's a really interesting question. And I guess thinking first about how the consumption of animals has changed over time, it depends what commodity you're looking at, essentially. So I suppose I'd say, things like meat and dairy have massively increased, arguably since the 16th century, but with particular boosts in the 19th century and the 20th century following the advent of factory farming. And of course, empires is a factor in that as well. By contrast, obviously I talked a bit about this in the last book, but the use of animals for fashion has broadly declined in the 20th century, having sort of risen to a peak in the 19th century. And it's in part because of the retraction of empire. It's in part due to new sort of ethical concerns about the use of animals for these reasons. And it's in part, maybe primarily due to the advent of sort of synthetic materials. So things like nylon replacing furs or wools, or things like plastic replacing ivory. Similarly, things like animal medicines have broadly declined, at least in the West, though taken off in the Far East in the 20th century. And things like the use of animal fats and oils for cooking or for lighting, again, they rise to a peak probably by about 1850, but after that they decline, again, mostly because of the discovery of petroleum. So I guess it's quite a mixed picture, and it sometimes depends where you're looking as to what's actually happening with commodities. And I guess I would also note, which again, I really thought about writing the book, some commodities that we maybe think of as being quite traditional or quite old actually have quite new histories, and you can date them to particular periods. So the historian Jacobina Arch, for example, shows how the consumption of whale meat in Japan, which is often billed as traditional, actually only really became popular in the 1940s, and that was because they put it on school menus as a kind of form of inexpensive protein after World War II. So we have to be aware of some of these factors. Thinking about empire, I guess, specifically, and its role in animal commodity consumption, I think there are different ways in which this operates. So on the one hand, imperial expansion gives access to new animal commodities. So, for example, when the Dutch discover Papua New Guinea in the 17th century and are able to control it, they're then able to send back things like birds of paradise feathers. Equally, the colonisation of Mexico and Peru by the Spanish brings turkeys and guinea pigs back to Europe. A second important way in which empire is significant is because it also increases the land for rearing livestock. So again, when the Spanish conquer the Americas, things like sheep and cattle do really well, particularly in big grasslands like the llanos of Venezuela. And they're consumed both in America, increasing meat consumption significantly, but then things like their hides are also sent back to Europe. And then, of course, this expands in the 19th century when you're able to sort of refrigerate meat or tin it and send it back from places like Argentina and things like New Zealand in the case of lamb. And that has a big impact on sort of working class diets in Europe by basically outsourcing meat consumption. So I guess there's that relationship of empire expanding and new commodities being discovered, but you also have it often working in the other direction where people are actually effectively colonising areas because they want to get access to animal materials. So you kind of see this in Russia, for instance, in the 18th century, where they constantly push eastward through Siberia as they hunt out things like sable and sea otters, and then they colonise the region. And you see it too in trying to kind of clear areas for livestock grazing. So you see this, for instance, in Patagonia in the second half of the 19th century, where basically indigenous animals are moved off the land, which is often a euphemism for killing them, and sheep are kind of introduced in their place. So there are lots of kind of different things going on there, but empire is certainly significant.
Yeah, it's absolutely significant in so many different ways, as you've just outlined there. And I think one aspect of which that kind of comes through in that, but of course is consistent with human-animal relations, not just related to empire, is kind of not just which animals are where and for what reasons, but how we think about them as well, right? Ideas of sort of before empire, you might have conceptions of, guinea pigs are not a thing known to Spain, for example. Then it's like, oh my goodness, this strange new creature. And now we have them in like primary school classrooms and don't really think about them. So they've kind of gone on a journey from sort of, for particular populations, complete unknown to exotic to really normal. And that shows up in a lot of the different animals you talk about in the book. So I wonder if you can tell us more about the extent to which, the ways in which this definition of kind of quote unquote exotic has changed over time.
Absolutely. So, I mean, guinea pigs are quite an interesting example because they're used for different things in different continents. So, in Peru, they are largely used, some of them are sacrificed, but they're also eaten. They're a primary sort of source of protein. But then when they're shipped to Europe, they're mostly used as pets. And then later on, they're used as laboratory animals. So you do get this kind of shift in usage. But yeah, I mean, thinking about definitions of exotic, I think they do change over time and also according to place, as you've suggested. So, a capybara is exotic in Portugal, but it's not exotic in Brazil. If you think particularly about, I guess, exhibiting exotic animals, again, I think often what is classed as exotic, that changes as empires expand. So, what it might be exotic in the medieval period will be maybe an elephant or rhinoceros. And one or two of these do get exhibited in Europe in that period. So there's reportedly an elephant in the Tower of London in 1252, which sadly doesn't live very long because it's only fed on wine, which is not great for elephants. And then there's later on, you get a giraffe being exhibited in Florence by Lorenzo de' Medici that's sent him from Egypt. So those animals are exotic because that's the world that is known to those people at that time. But then I guess what you start to see is as new areas are explored, new animals are discovered. And so the kind of frontier and parameters of what's exotic changes. So for instance, in the 16th century, the Europeans, as you suggested with guinea pigs, that will be Europeans discovering America. And you then get an influx of stuff like your marmosets, llamas, and particularly your parrots to Europe. Later on in the 18th century, with the discovery of the Pacific, Australasia, things like cassowaries start to be exhibited in European menageries, and obviously kangaroos. In the 19th century, again, Africa is colonised more intensively, so you start to get African elephants, the first hippopotamus sent to a zoo in Britain. And then I guess in the 20th century, there's a real fascination with, again, I guess more recently discovered animals. So pandas, obviously Chinese people knew about them, Europeans didn't until the late 19th century, and you don't get the first pandas in zoos until the 1930s. Equally, things like okapis, which are these slightly sort of giraffe-like animals. I don't know if people know what an okapi looks like, but they live deep in the rainforest in the Congo. And again, Europeans hadn't even heard of them until 1900, and it takes them quite a long time to actually see a live okapi and to bring one back. And things like penguins as well become more exotic as people discover Antarctica. So there is this kind of shift, I guess, over time in terms of what qualifies as exotic and how people are reacting to that.
An elephant being entirely fed on wine. Well, that's an image that's going to stay with me. And I think makes this point precisely about how different animals are treated over time, and sort of what the expectations are, I suppose, of what is exotic and what humans are meant to do with these non-human exotic animals. And I have to say, it does also seem a bit cruel to me, at least in this 21st century perspective, to do that to an elephant. But of course, now we know what to feed elephants or not. Presumably, the Tower of London and that was not their knowledge base. But what are some other ways that definitions of animal cruelty have changed over time?
That's another really, really interesting question. I mean, on the elephant, I would just note that they thought they were treating the elephant terribly well because they saw the elephant as being kind of royal. And so wine was what you gave to royalty. So that was not deliberate cruelty. There is certainly plenty of that, sadly, throughout human history. And yeah, I think definitions of what cruelty is have changed over time, and also sort of levels of concern about it. So, you certainly find, I guess in the early modern period, you find examples of individual people caring about animals and maybe doing certain things, to protect them. So, for example, the Buddhist monk Zhu Hong condemned the wearing of silk because that involved killing silkworms, and he also didn't eat meat. In Europe, though, particularly, the view tends to be that humans should have dominion over animals, as it says in the Bible, and there's no particular sense that animals should be treated kindly, although, again, individual people clearly do that. You start to get shifts in ideas about animals, again, particularly from the late sort of 1700s, and these are sort of fueled by, by various factors, sometimes by your changing social conditions. So things like urbanisation, giving people more of a view effectively of animals being driven through the streets, sometimes treated cruelly. Also new sort of religious and social ideas, new ways of looking at animals. So you start to get sort of shifts which ultimately result in the rise of an animal protection movement in the 19th century. And I guess, since then, again, we start to see changing definitions of what is cruel, what should we be doing with animals, what is acceptable. So early on in the history of organisations like the RSPCA, the big concern is things like animal baiting, bull baiting, bear baiting, also the mistreatment of working animals in the streets. Then you start to get a shift to being concerned about, I guess, more hidden forms of cruelty, so particularly vivisection, the use of animals in science. There's then a bit of a shift in concern about wild animals and their exploitation, particularly for things like fashion, so fur and feathers. And as you move into the 20th century, you start as well to get new questions about not just animal welfare, but about animal rights. So should animals enjoy some of the rights that humans enjoy? For example, the right not to be imprisoned, the right not to be tortured. And you start to get sort of a more radical animal rights movement emerging that doesn't just want to, again, protect animals and mitigate cruelty, but actually to sort of abolish the use of animals as property or as labourers. One example of that is, in 2015, there's this really interesting case in Argentina where a judge rules that an orangutan called Sandra, who used to be in Buenos Aires Zoo, is not an animal, but is actually a non-human person. And that means she can't be kept in captivity. So she ends up getting sent to a sanctuary. So you get these sort of shifting definitions in terms of what counts as cruel and which animals are encompassed by anti-cruelty legislation. And some of these obviously are affected by shifting treatment of animal over time, and also shifting ideas about animal cognition, animal sentience.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting to think about. How the law, for example, is brought into this. But the aspect of that answer I'd most like to pick up on is working animals, because that's also something that has changed. Not just kind of which animals do what kind of work, thinking about the role of horses in the Spanish conquest of Latin America, or animal astronauts in the sort of second half of the 20th century. But also the debates about animal labor have changed as well, as you were hinting at there. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So again, I think this slightly parallels the different kinds of forms of labour that animals are doing, and the quantity of animal labour, really. So you broadly see the volume of animal labour increasing until about 1850, after which things like steam power, electricity, and the advent of the motor car kind of take over from animals in many different roles. And you also see animals sort of becoming more specialised in their jobs over time. So it's particularly obvious with things like dogs that are bred to perform particular roles. So that might be greyhounds that are bred for hunting, terriers that are bred for catching rats. And there's even a kind of dog called the turnspit dog, which is basically bred to run in a wheel and turn a bit of meat on a spit so that it will cook. So you have all these kind of different roles that animals are performing. And they obviously come with different sort of hardships and forms of exploitation for the animal. So I think going alongside that, you do see shifting attitudes and debates as well. So I guess I say before about 1800, animal labour is pretty much regarded as essential, and there aren't too many people who query this. One or two, but it's not widely condemned. That doesn't necessarily mean animals were all treated badly. There are certainly examples of hunters, for example, really caring for the animals that they partnered with, so dogs, falcons, even hunting cheetahs. What it does mean, though, is that people, I guess, took animal labour for granted. And it was pretty common for animals to labour for several years. Then, when they were no longer able to do that, they would most likely be slaughtered. This would happen with, say, oxen that were used to plough fields. Again, and kind of in line with the shifts in attitudes to animal cruelty, some of this changes, particularly in the 19th century. So you start to see organisations like the RSPCA and its American counterpart, the ASPCA, spending a lot of time prosecuting people for, say, overdriving horses or donkeys in the streets. And actually, the ASPCA is quite notorious for shooting a lot of these horses to put them out of their misery. It's one of the main things it ends up doing, which is obviously it sounds a bit strange to us now. You also start to get people querying particular kinds of labour. So one of the examples I look at in the book is the case of dog carts. So these are basically dogs that were used often by poorer members of society to pull carts of, again, things like milk, particularly common, other forms of vegetable produce, sometimes meat, and they would sort of take them into the city. However, in Britain in particular, this becomes really controversial in the 19th century because some people think that, dogs' feet aren't suitable for walking on hard, flinty roads. And there's also lots of cases of people overdriving their dogs or not feeding them. So as a result of that, dog carts get abolished in 1854. And this is partly because of this rise in sort of humanitarian feeling. It's worth noting, though, that this doesn't actually benefit the dogs because a lot of them, if they're no longer useful for work, just end up being abandoned or killed. And this is a pattern you see, elsewhere with other animals. So I suppose some of the debates that we need to think about are, actually, are animal labourers, are they respected and valued? And in some cases, yes, I think they are. Or, are they just exploited and mistreated, which, again, clearly they are in many other instances. But also, I think it's where humans fit within that. So, by abolishing dog carts, you're really hurting the poorer people that operated them, who then, can't maintain their livelihood. And I think we see some of those debates playing out these days, particularly in non-European countries where people perhaps go as tourists, see animals labouring, look at a donkey pulling a cart and say, isn't that terribly cruel? And it may be, but you need to think about the impact of the people as well within that. So I think some of this is quite ethically complicated, and I'm not always certain that labouring animals are treated worse than animals that don't labour.
Yeah, and it's interesting how much the ethical questions here are woven through all of the topics. There's so many different ways in which ethics is relevant to think through. And that's, of course, true for labouring animals, as you've mentioned, but also true for pets, especially as, based on what you said in the book, our understanding of pets has improved recently in the scholarship, going beyond sort of the classic, pets in America, pets in Britain, going well beyond that. Are there maybe some of those updates you'd like to tell us more about?
Yeah, I think, as you say, a lot of the scholarship on pets started being about pets in its European context. And there's some really great stuff on, dogs in 19th century Paris or cats in Renaissance Italy. But I have noted, and I think this is only going to increase, hopefully, as more and more scholars look at this, there's been really important work on non-European contexts. So some of that, I guess, is thinking about the expansion of European forms of pet keeping to non-European arenas as a result of empire or globalization. And there's been some really interesting stuff looking at dogs in Japan, for example, and looking at dogs being introduced into places like Nigeria as well as part of the imperial system. Perhaps even more interestingly, though, there's been work looking at, I guess, other ways of keeping pets that are maybe indigenous to non-European countries. So there's been work, for example, on cats in China, which has noted that, they started to actually particularly breed the first sort of long-haired cats in China as long ago as the 11th century. And some of these are then later exported to Europe. There's also been work looking at the keeping of insects as pets in Japan. So Eric Laurent has talked a little bit about this and described how things like crickets were often kept as pets, particularly by children. They were known as mushi. And again, that's not something we normally do in Europe, although I do remember when I was young, there was a bit of a craze for sort of stick insects as pets. But generally, we don't keep insects in that way. And really recently, there's been a really interesting book by Marcy Norton called The Wild and the Tame, in which she looks at pet keeping in particularly Amazonian societies and sort of suggests there's a kind of different philosophy behind pet keeping than there is in Europe. So, while in the West, we tend to, at least to some extent, treat pets as commodities, and we often, I guess, try to sort of curtail their natural instincts. We confine them, we put them in cages, we chain them. She suggests that actually in lowland South America, indigenous people don't do that. So instead, they do tame wild animals, and these are often the offspring of animals that they've maybe hunted for food, so things like tapirs or monkeys. But they then just keep them really for the pleasure of their company, and they feed them to win their affection, which I'm sure works well given my own experience with my cat. But they also significantly let them have their freedom, so they don't try to confine them. The animals just kind of come back because they want to. So Norton gives a really interesting example of a young manatee that is apparently trapped in fishing nets and then kept as a pet by a chief in Hispaniola, what's now the Dominican Republic. And he feeds it on yucca and millet, but again, he gives it the freedom to go about the lake. And similarly, the British explorer Henry Walter Bates talked about a parrot that he's not able to tame, but he gives it to an indigenous lady who then reportedly feeds the animal on her saliva, gives it freedom, and apparently renders it tame so that it'll actually stay with him. And he reflects that it's partly because they don't confine the animal that they all seem so happy. So you're kind of seeing a different reason for keeping pets than what you might see in Europe. And actually Norton extrapolates that to sort of point out that they don't really have the equivalent of livestock in Amazonia. So any animal that is tamed or domesticated is not ever eaten. So you have pet tapirs, and you might eat other members of the same species, but you'd never eat an animal that you had fed and that you had looked after. So it's a really different way of looking at species.
Yeah, it is a very different way. And we've been lucky enough to have her on the podcast speaking in more detail about that for any listeners who want more on that particular topic, because it is really interesting thinking about these different understandings of kind of what animals are treated for what purposes, and these questions of confinement versus not. And how, if you've treated an animal one way, how do you then treat it subsequently? And a lot of these questions come up not just in terms of pets, but also in terms of conservation, where we also see sort of conflicting, contradictory ideas about kind of compassion versus not. Can you talk about this in this context?
Yeah, I think conservation can be a very ethically complicated. It's broadly a good thing, but we need to think a bit about which animals we're conserving and why. And I guess some of the costs of that as well. Particularly for individual animals. So I guess, one thing I'd flag would be the quite selective nature of conservation, which is often really sort of anthropocentric. We conserve animals that we think are useful or beautiful or interesting. This is really obvious in early sort of forms of conservation. So when you get the first game regulations for northeastern Rhodesia, so what's now Zimbabwe in 1900, these explicitly protect vultures, secretary birds and owls because they're useful. It protects giraffes and gorillas because they're threatened with extinction. But it explicitly excludes lions, leopards, poisonous snakes, crocodiles, baboons, and other harmful monkeys because they're not useful for human beings and actually might be dangerous. So that's a really kind of selective form of conservation. Today, obviously, we're a little bit broader, hopefully, in terms of what we want to preserve. But you still see, a real bias towards preserving things like pandas or Galapagos tortoises or kakapos because, they're rare and exotic. It comes a little bit back to that question. And that means that they get more funding and more attention than, for example, snails in Hawaii that are equally endangered. So there are those kind of questions about what we conserve, what we channel our effort into. I think there are also sort of knottier questions about the practicalities of conservation. So, one issue that I would flag is what do you do with introduced or what are sometimes called invasive species, which may be doing a lot of damage to native fauna. But, do you cull them? Should we get rid of cane toads in Australia or hippopotami in Colombia? Should we get rid of grey squirrels in Britain? What are the costs of that? That does mean killing something to preserve something, which is ethically a bit complicated. Perhaps, less obviously, I guess there's also the question of what happens for animals that are perhaps bred in captivity, but are then reintroduced into the wild. And what are some of the trade-offs there? Because, what you often see, and again, this historian Monica Vassilia has shown this really interestingly in some of her work on animal reintroductions, is that basically a lot of animals that are reintroduced don't survive all that long because it's difficult to prepare them. So we know that of 15 golden lion tamarins that are released into Brazil in 1984, only 2 actually survive, and some of the others are returned to zoos because they're not coping. Some of them die because they eat poisonous fruits because they don't know what to eat. They've not had that experience, and some of them sadly die of exposure because they don't know to go into holes in trees to nest during the night. So again, we're sort of balancing here, the right and the well-being of individual animals in a bid to save the species. So that is pretty complicated. And I guess finally, there are just these bigger questions about, what are we actually trying to do through reintroductions or, more controversially, ththings like de-extinction that people are trying to achieve now by basically breeding animals, recreating them using DNA. But what does that actually mean, And, is it ethical to try and reintroduce an animal into an environment where actually the factors that caused it to go extinct are still there, the sort of human-animal conflict or whatever. So I think there are lots of actually quite interesting but complicated problems when it comes to conservation.
Well, and one of the tricky problems around it as well that I wonder if we can move to discussing is how these questions around what to do or not do with animals interact with campaigns about disadvantaged humans or campaigns for biodiversity that's looking at the ecosystem more broadly. What about that interaction?
Yeah, I think that's really significant as well, because people are obviously central to the treatment of animals. And again, you certainly see in things like conservation measures, sometimes, again, particularly in sort of early 20th century conservation, conserving an animal meant, building a national park and then excluding all the indigenous people from it, which is obviously hugely problematic. And you see that happening in, for instance, Albert Park in the Belgian Congo. So there are those kind of questions. And I think, again, you see some of these issues when you look at questions of animal rights and animal welfare. So sometimes these movements can align really nicely together. So you often find that people who care about the rights of animals do also care about the rights of people. So some of the people in the RSPCA in its earliest years are also fighting for the abolition of slavery. William Wilberforce is one. And you later get people who are fighting for things like the abolition of the death penalty or women's suffrage, but also campaigning for animals to be better treated. So these things can align quite well. And generally, people who want animals to be treated well today tend to be on the kind of left of the political spectrum. That was perhaps less the case in the 19th century. But equally, sometimes certain communities may see protection of animals as working against them, and not without reason. So again, in Britain, when they abolished things like bull and bear baiting, these are mostly lower class sports. And when you start targeting people for overdriving horses on the streets, say, that's mostly lower class people, often caught up themselves in the kind of oppressive capitalist system, who are then getting fined and punished for basically just trying to earn a living. So that can be pretty problematic, and arguably much more so when it gets extended to a sort of colonial setting. So you'll find British people in Hong Kong complaining about people eating dogs, for instance, or attempts to abolish things like cockfighting in places like Cuba and the Philippines under US rule. So there's a lot of this sense of animal welfare being part of this sort of wider civilizing mission. And I guess you also sometimes find this concern that sometimes people worry more about animals than humans. This always comes up in Britain, that people give more money to donkey sanctuaries than to, say, homeless charities, which is probably true. But you find historic examples of this as well. So I came across this example of a visitor to Britain in 1942 during the war, going to London Zoo, and he sees there a fashionably dressed lady feeding a chimpanzee bits of cake, peeled apples and quarters of oranges. And all the while she's doing that, working class children are sort of watching hungrily, hoping that they might get a bit of the orange. And this guy sort of questions, it's nice that she's looking after this chimpanzee, but what about human rights here? And you see some of this be extended into the present day. So some people might remember the case of Cecil the lion that was shot by an American dentist in 2015 in Zimbabwe, and this generated a lot of outrage, and rightly. But it's also been pointed out that there was more public anger about his killing of this one lion than about US police shooting black citizens in the USA, and it is something that Bénédicte Boisseron has talked about quite extensively in her work. So you do find these, I guess, quite complex sort of power dynamics, and we need to be a bit aware of that. Again, as I've suggested, there's a bit of a tension sometimes between conservation and animal welfare as well. So again, the two often go in line. Both environmentalists and animal rights activists would be against factory farming. The rights activists because it's cruel to the animals, they suffer really poor conditions. The environmentalists because it's pretty bad for the environment as well, with the pollution and pesticides. But then again, as I've mentioned, things like invasive species, that's complicated. Should we cull them? Should we not? How do we balance the right of the individual animal against, the right of a species to exist? So I think there are, lots of complexities and tensions to unpick there.
Yeah, definitely a lot of things to think about. But of course, that just adds to all the other things we've mentioned that are worth thinking about as well. But is there anything we haven't mentioned from the book that you particularly want to highlight before we finish our discussion?
I guess I'd like to flag up some of the both some of them negative, but some more positive things that I found whilst researching the book. So I suppose one of the case studies that I encountered, and which I used in the chapter looking at animal experimentation, was actually about using live baboons as crash test dummies in the 1970s by the Ford Motor Car Company. It's a bit of a grisly story. This was quite interesting, though, because basically these baboons were used to test things like airbags and seat belts and to sort of ascertain how effective they were. But it became really controversial because a lot of people opposed it, suggested that baboons shouldn't be used in this way. And one of the things I found quite interesting in these debates was, firstly, which species should we use for various kinds of tests or for other purposes? And clearly that plays a big part in how we see different animals. So, had they used, for instance, say rats or frogs in this experiment, I don't think anybody would have cared all that much. But also, I guess, ideas about, the purpose of, if you have to mistreat animals or exploit them, are some kind of uses more acceptable than others? And I think clearly they are, and this is certainly the case today, but arguably has been throughout history. So, using animals for medical testing is often deemed more acceptable perhaps than using them for, as in this case, crash tests. So you find all these different kind of nuances really when you look at it. I guess just to sort of put a slightly more positive spin on the research I've done for the book, though, we've talked a lot about the negative things here, and I think that's fair, because a lot of human-animal relationships are exploitative and can be abusive. But I suppose I'd also just like to flag that I did find some much more positive human-animal interactions and some, I guess, just more weird and quirky stories. Some of these made it into the book, some didn't. So there was the case, for example, of an alligator, apparently called Mark Antony, who lived for 14 years on the New Orleans Board of Trade and apparently knew how to turn the tap of his bath on with his tail. There was a wallaby in 1920s Western Australia that was very fond of Yorkshire pudding. And there was quite a touching example, which I do include in the book, of a British soldier in the army in World War I who rescued a terrier dog on the Battle of the Somme and then petitioned the RSPCA for funding so that he could take it back to Blighty, as he put it, because he couldn't imagine leaving the animal in Belgium. So you do find these more positive relationships. And actually, when I'm researching animal history, this is what I really like to encounter, people talking about often pets, but sometimes other kinds of animals, and speaking about them with a degree of intimacy. We can't always believe what they say, but it's not all doom and gloom. I suppose the message I'd slightly like to end with.
That's a lovely way, I think, to end our conversation about the book. Before I let you go, though, is there anything you're currently working on or looking to work on next that you want to give us a brief preview of?
Very briefly, I'm working on a book called A Cultural History of Birds in the 19th Century, which is part of a big 6-volume series by Bloomsbury on the cultural history of birds. This is an edited book, so I'm working with some other wonderful people on that, and it's slowly in production, but it's given me a chance to roll out some of the kakapos and egrets and ostriches I've been working on a little bit in this book, and think about them in a bit more detail. And longer term, I'm also thinking about doing a project looking at animal training effectively in the context of circuses and menageries, particularly lion taming, which probably won't be that cheery, but that's the long-term project I hope to be working on. So more elephants and wine, maybe, for me.
Perhaps. Well, we shall wait and see. But of course, in the meantime, listeners can read the book we've been discussing, titled Animals in World History, published by Routledge in 2024. Helen, thank you so much for coming back onto the New Books Network podcast.
Thanks, Miranda. You're really welcome.